So welcome everybody to our panel, Lacunae in the Research on Gender and in Islam, Authorship, Methodology and Solutions. This panel examines the problem that persists regarding sources and methods in research on gender in Islam. Today we would like to discuss approaches to solving them with a focal on historical and theological research. There is a persistent belief to this day that women made negligible contributions to the development and differentiation of the classical disciplines of Islamic theology in fields like Quranic exegesis, Hadith sciences, Islamic law, Kalam, I have to breathe, and Islamic philosophy, especially in the pre-modern era. Seldom, if ever, are women named among well-known scholars, and this thesis may seem correct at first glance. Yet it has not been proven through research. Not only has this thesis not been examined from a theological and/or historical perspective, but there also remains an inquiry into the reasons why and the mechanisms through which women were kept from participating in the formation of theological disciplines or were pushed out of these knowledge-forming processes in the formative phase and beyond. To address these questions, we will start with a lecture by Professor Geissinger, followed by a discussion involving the speaker and three panel discussants who are Professor ถี่enita Karić, Dr. Iyad Abu Ali, and myself, Nimet Şeker. So we will start with your paper. Professor Geissinger completed a doctoral degree in religious studies from the University of Toronto in 2008 with the areas of concentration in classical Quranic exegesis and Muslim intellectual history. Having taught in the Religious Studies Department at Michigan State University from 2007 to 2009, as a lecturer, assistant professor, Professor Geissinger joined the religion program at Carleton University in 2009. Geissinger's research interests include the Quran and its exegesis, the Hadith, literature and its interpretive tradition, and literary approaches, particularly gender and queer theory, to reading classical Muslim texts. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Okay, so before diving in here, we're holding three things in tension, or at least we're trying to. On one hand, that in classical Sunni Quran commentary, interpretational authority is constructed as masculine, and there are a number of mechanisms that also, practically speaking, kept that more or less as usually the norm. But classical Quranic interpretation also features representations of female sources of exegetical materials and occasional representations of women interpreting the Quran. And this is a textual feature of Tafsir which extends over a millennium, and it still has an effect on some types of Quranic interpretation today. So it's an important dimension of Tafsir, I would say. And also shifting historical contexts. So we're holding all these things in tension, and we are not trying, well, at least I'm not trying to resolve them. Okay, so classical Muslim sources present us with a small, scattered, and frequently laconic selections of representations of several modes of female involvement in Quran commentary, or tafsir. The existence of such representations has long been known to scholars in tafsir studies. For example, over a century ago, Ignaz Goldziher called attention to the presence of some hadiths attributed to a wife of the Prophet Muhammad, Aisha bint Abi Bakr, as well as to some other early Muslim women in a number of classical Sunni tafsir texts. I keep saying Sunni because I have not extensively researched Shia tafsir texts, so that's a future project, I hope. Scholars have noted that the names of a few medieval transmitters of several exegetical works are female. Relatedly, it has also long been noticed that among the anecdotes recounted in classical biographical works about pious women, a few attribute sayings to them on the meanings of one or another Quranic verse. But representations of these types are not only known today to specialists in tafsir studies, far from it. Many have been popularized, and a number now circulate online, with a potential audience far beyond anything classical scholars could ever have envisioned. Since the late 19th century Common Era, Muslim discourses which rhetorically appeal to notions of religious or cultural authenticity have attempted to enlist elements of the past in order to address problems and questions in the present. In ongoing debates about matters related to family, gender roles, and sexuality in contemporary Muslim communities and societies, a selection of events, persons, anecdotes, sayings, and other purported fragments of the past have been and continue to be utilized in order to legitimate a range of views. Participants in such debates have included would-be reformers, intellectuals, political leaders, religious scholars, activists, journalists, and Muslim feminists, among others. In the process, what I have termed a quote-unquote reservoir of proof texts has gradually formed and also become popularized. A number of pious and scholarly female figures of the past have been incorporated into this reservoir, as well as some exegetical hadiths credited to women. Yet, despite this attention that some representations of female involvement in classical Quran commentary have received, these fascinating depictions remain understudied and have yet to receive the analytical focus that they deserve. Such representations are still quite often treated as at best a niche or confessional concern. There are several reasons for this. One is that they are usually presumed to be inconsequential to our understandings of the workings of the classical tafsir genre. This is partly due to ongoing debates about what the boundaries of the classical tafsir genre are. Is it only limited to books written as verse-by-verse commentaries on the Quran? What about traces of orally delivered Quranic interpretation? And what about what Sa'diya Sheikh terms tafsir of praxis, so interpretation that is embodied rather than written? But even taking a broader definition of the classical tafsir genre runs up against the fact that although classical sources do occasionally acknowledge or praise a woman's knowledge of the Quran or its interpretation, they also provide much evidence for concluding that such women would have been very few and limited to marginal roles in the development of tafsir in any case, for reasons that we will discuss. Another reason is that the relationship of such representations to history in the sense of, quote-unquote, what really happened, is frequently difficult to determine. It is often hard to say whether a given female figure actually lived, much less to verify any historical facts about her. An additional factor is that some of these representations have come to be included within the reservoir of proof texts. As a result, there is a tendency to equate researching them with engaging in polemics or apologetics about the perennial question of the status of women in Islam, all the quotation marks there, and probably the trigger warnings. At times, there is also the suspicion that such research risks entanglement, unwittingly or otherwise, in the valorization of scholarly female figures of the past in order to discipline Muslim women today and delegitimize any female voices calling for change. Textual representations and possible or actual traces of women's involvement in the interpretation and transmission of classical tafsir works are a set of marginalized phenomena in history, in our sources, and also in our field. That this is the case is the outcome of human choices and actions. The concrete factors and mechanisms which produced this marginalization can and should be studied. Understanding how the center and the margins have been and continue to be constructed, there is no center without creating and perpetuating margins, tells us much about the workings of the entire structure. This is key to analyzing the shifting ways that interpretive authority was constructed and maintained over time and the power relations involved. What is presently known about women's involvement in tafsir across time? There is much about the history of the classical Sunni tafsir genre which remains unknown or continues to be debated. This is particularly true of the formative period of Quran commentary and also of any involvement of women in its development and transmission. Available sources suggest the following, inevitably partial, picture of women's roles from the time of the companions until the 9th century Hijri, 15th century Common Era. So what I call the long formative period, long because all kinds of things are happening in it, meaning from Muhammad's lifetime until 338 Hijri, so 950 Common Era. The 1st or 7th century is when the female figures lived who later came to be credited as sources of a small number of variant Quranic readings, paraphrastic interpretations, so these provide synonyms of Quranic words or phrases, hadiths, legal opinions, as well as some views on the meanings of certain verses. Several of them were the Prophet's wives. Aisha in particular comes to be presented as a prominent source of such materials, and Salama as well to a much lesser extent. Other putative female sources from this time are certain companions. It is important to note that there are far fewer female successors who are credited as sources of these materials, and that this is the opposite of the situation with male sources of exegesis. The number of male authorities on the pages of tafsir works expands over time. There are multiple historical uncertainties surrounding questions of whether such hadiths, variant readings, and so on, which come to be regarded by some Quran commentators as relevant to exegetical questions, can reliably be traced back to early Muslim women. In some cases, isnad retrojection appears to have taken place. In many, if not most of these materials, their relevance to the interpretation of a particular Quranic verse or verses appears to be largely, if not solely, due to the exegetical intention of later Quran commentators, not of the female source to which they are ascribed. To take but one example, a hadith related on the authority of Makil recounts that when she wanted to perform Umrah, so the minor pilgrimage, she asked her husband if she could borrow a camel of his, which he had designated only for use in the path of God, so fi sabilillah. The most obvious understanding of that phrase would be that he intended to use it for battle. Makil goes to the Prophet and tells him about this, so he directs her husband to allow her to use the camel. As Hajj and Umrah are deeds in the path of God, and Umrah in Ramadan is like performing the Hajj or will be rewarded like it. The Dur al-Manthur, more on this Quran commentary shortly, quotes this hadith in its interpretation of Q 2:196, so Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 196. Complete the pilgrimages, the Hajj and the Umrah for God, and so on to the end of the verse. While Makil's hadith is about her desire and evident determination to perform Umrah, it does not relate directly to this Quranic verse. Nowhere does she express any intention to interpret this verse, or even awareness that someone might regard her anecdote as interpretive. Historically speaking, female companions and successors could not have regarded themselves as, quote-unquote, doing tafsir, since classical tafsir as we know it did not yet exist in their time. In other words, centuries after their deaths, some early Muslim female figures become unwitting providers of exegetical raw materials. Exegetical works from the late 2nd, 8th, and early 3rd, 9th centuries appear to indicate that at that time, the use of such materials attributed to women often did not yet follow discernible patterns, which suggests that a core of information of this type had not been passed down and was still in the process of forming. But regardless of such historical problems, the attribution of such materials to certain female companions, and to a much lesser extent to some female successors, had an increasingly apparent impact on classical Sunni tafsir genre from the 3rd, 9th century on. The Quran commentaries of At-Tabari, who died in 311-923, and Al-Maturidi, who died in 333-944, contain a selection of such materials. More consequentially, the same would be true of the early medieval Quran commentary of Athalabi, who died in 427-1035, a work which, as Walid Saleh has demonstrated, has had an immense historical influence on the development of classical Sunni tafsir. So a myth was taking shape. Myth, I'm using the word here in the sense of a generative, meaning-making story which shapes the religious self-understanding of believers. The myth of Aisha in particular as a preeminent female source of exegetical materials on a wide variety of topics, as well as some other early Muslim female figures to varying extents. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, back to the long formative period. As the 3rd, 9th century exegetes were increasingly incorporating hadiths and other materials credited to long-dead early Muslim female figures within their Quran commentaries, though to widely varying extents, the notion of female interpretive authority that they were textually elaborating was an ever more retrospective, archaic construction. By contrast, it appeared that in their view, few, if any, of their female contemporaries or near contemporaries had said much of anything worth quoting. Nevertheless, a few pious or renunciant women who reportedly lived during the early 3rd, 9th century were later memorialized as having had knowledge of the Quran and to at sometimes have offered interpretations of certain verses, at least according to Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami's, he died in 412-1021, biographical work on Sufi women. As-Sulami recounts that Fatima of Nishapur, who died in 223-834, quote, would discourse on the meanings of the Quran, unquote, which her student, the famous renunciant Dhunnun, who died in 245-860, reportedly said deeply impressed him. The entry goes on to give an example of her interpretation of several prosaic Quranic verses about fighting. So these are verses 47, 20-21. And her interpretation reframes these verses as addressing a person's internal struggle against their desires. In his entry for a wise woman of Damascus, who was the teacher of another female renunciant, Rabia of Syria, As-Sulami recounts an anecdote in which this wise woman pauses her recitation from a copy of the Quran and interprets for Rabia the verse, except the one who comes before God with a heart that is salim, till this is 2689. She states that this verse refers to the heart that meets God while containing nothing other than God. Neither of these interpretations credited to female renunciants appears to have made it into the Sunni tafsir genre, as far as I've been able to determine. This could be for several reasons, chief among them hermeneutical ones. These interpretations do not address grammatical or other linguistic questions, nor do they quote hadiths or views of other exegetes. Any authority that these interpretations might be thought to have would be based on one woman's reputation for pious insight into the Quran's meaning. It is also noteworthy that although Ibn al-Jawzi, who died in 597-1200, has entries for both these women in his biographical work on pious persons of the past, and he's basing these two entries on Sulami's work, he elects to downplay their exegetical and religious authority overall. And by the way, he doesn't quote them in his commentary either. So he presents Fatima of Nishapur and the wise woman as pious believers, with the implication that impious men should feel ashamed to be outdone by women and mend their ways. While he depicts these two women as giving good advice to their students, there is little or no suggestion in the entries that the community might or should consider them as sources of Quranic exegesis. On to the 5th, 11th to the 9th, 15th centuries, learning and transmission on the margins. With the 5th, 11th century, there is some scattered evidence of a very limited degree of involvement on the margins of learning and transmission on the part of a couple of women from scholarly families. The unnamed daughter of the scholar Abdul Wahid ibn Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Ahmed, or Abul Faraj al-Ansari, he died in 486 Hijri, the daughter memorized his Kitab al-Jawahir, a 30-volume tafsir that he had reportedly written. This is according to Shamsuddin Dawoodi's Tabaqat al-Mufassirin, a collection of biographies of Quran commentators. The commentary does not appear to have survived, as far as I know. 2 women, Kamila and Sitt al-Hasan, were recorded as present in the late 5th, 11th century for some of the assemblies at which the Tafsir Mujahid bin Jabr was read out. Such a reading was performed so that its transmitter would verify the accuracy of the students' written copies of it. Being present at events of this type was believed to be religiously meritorious and a source of barakah, or blessing. The next several centuries see a few women transmit exegetical works. Shuhda bint Abi Nasr Ahmed ibn al-Faraj al-Dainawari, who died in 574-1178, transmitted the Ma'ani al-Quran of Az-Zajjaj, who died in 311-923. The well-known Quran commentator Az-Zamakhshari, who died in 538-1144, famously issued a general license to transmit all his writings to 2 of his students, one of whom was Zainab bint Abdurrahman al-Sha'ri of Nishapur. She died in 615-1218. As a result, she transmitted his Kashaf. More on her in a moment. Fatima bint Muhammad ibn al-Munajjah, who lived in the 8th, 9th, 14th, 15th centuries, is credited with having transmitted the Tafsir Sufyan ibn Uyayna, an early work which does not seem to have survived. The function of these women's transmission of books, which Asma Said likens to the role of an editor, was to ensure that the text was copied and passed down accurately. The gatherings at which these books were transmitted had a practical function to enable them to be accurately preserved and passed on. They also had a ritual function of reaffirming the links between the participants and the books to the sacred past through the isnad. It is important to bear in mind that the main focus of these women's studies and transmission activities was not tafsir, however, but hadith. There is little evidence that any of these women I've mentioned would have had much specialized knowledge of Quran exegesis or even a particular interest in tafsir books. The involvement of these women in the transmission of a few exegetical works is most likely a side effect of the reemergence of significant numbers of female hadith transmitters from the mid-4th, 10th to the 10th, 16th centuries. As Asma Said demonstrates, while a number of early Muslim women are said to have participated in the transmission of hadiths, by the end of the 1st or 7th century, women only rarely did so. This was because developing standards in the field of hadith transmission, including the expectation of travel to study face-to-face with multiple teachers over a period of years, advanced legal and linguistic knowledge, a reputation for strong powers of memory, effectively prevented most women's involvement. But as Said also shows, by the mid-4th, 10th century, standards for hadith scholars had shifted in ways that made involvement significantly more open to girls and women from scholarly families. The career of Zainab bint Abdurrahman al-Sha'ri is a good illustration of the impact of such changes. Az-Zamakhshari died when she was less than 14 years old. A general license, or ijaza, given to her by Az-Zamakhshari, which authorized her to transmit all the books he had written, including his famed Quran commentary, Al-Kashaf, would presumably have been granted either as a result of her attendance at his classes as a young child, or because her father, who was a religious scholar, or perhaps another family member, would have obtained it on her behalf. Both of these practices of receiving ijazas were permitted by this time. with the expectation that when the child was old enough, they would learn the works for which they had ijazas and then transmit them. Having received ijazas as a young girl, decades later, once her childbearing years had passed, she had reached the age at which social strictures on free, respectable women's movements and interactions with males outside the household were relaxed, and her reputation for piety and knowledge was established, she could and did transmit multiple works, mostly hadith books, but also as the Zamakhshari's Kashaf. How consequential this Quran commentary would turn out to be for the classical tafsir genre, neither she nor most others likely could have anticipated. Women, tafsir, and barriers to participation. As this brief outline of Zainab's life indicates, there were a number of gendered and other status-related practical and societal barriers, even to the involvement on tafsir's margins of women from scholarly families, which was a segment of medieval Muslim society that would have constituted only a very small and comparatively privileged proportion of the population. Transmitting books was a demanding scholarly undertaking, which could be reconciled with the socially expected life cycle of a female member of such a family, if the family wished to facilitate this, if the husband she would be married to was also willing to permit it, if she had an aptitude for it, and if she lived to a ripe old age. A great many ifs were at stake, but the degree and intensity of education required for such involvement in the transmission of books was not at the level that would have been necessary in order to be regarded as qualified to write a mainstream classical Quran commentary. Such practical obstacles were intertwined with ideational ones. The classical tafsir genre constructs religious and interpretive authority as paradigmatically the domain of the free adult Muslim man. This was in accordance with prevalent understandings of gender at that time, which were like a scale or a hierarchical spectrum. The free, sane, able-bodied adult Muslim man was thought to most completely embody human intellectual, spiritual, and physical potential. All others, free women, free children, enslaved persons of various ages and genders, mukhannath and others, were held to embody such potential to varyingly lesser extents, varying depending on the degree of their distance from this male ideal. Following from this, free adult male Muslims were accorded the most autonomy over their lives, bodies, time, and movements. They were also the ones expected to exercise political and social power and to supervise and discipline the inhabitants of their households. Within such a structure, free Muslim women, particularly elite ones, were accorded certain types of power, particularly in relation to those whose status was lower. But this was not supposed to risk disrupting the overall hierarchy, whether within the household or in society. Hierarchical constructions of gender are woven into the very fabric of the classical tafsir genre, not only through received interpretations of an array of verses, but its axiomatic assumptions about existence. Yet, for reasons such as these, the mainstream Sunni classical tafsir genre was not hospitable to most types of female involvement. At the same time, it fostered the growth of the myth of Aisha, along with Salama and a small number of other early Muslim women, as imagined sources of exegetical materials related to a range of historical, legal, theological, pietistic, and other topics, at least at times. From the evidence presently available to us, it seems that this myth would finally attain its fullest, most developed form 5 centuries after Athalabi. In Jalal ad-Din as-Suyuti's, so he died in 1505, Dur al-Manthur. The Dur is a Quran commentary which, most unusually and certainly diverging from the classical Sunni hermeneutical mainstream, is entirely made up of hadiths. Its tendency to quote obscure hadiths, which few, if any, previous Quran commentaries appear to have included, meant that a number of hadiths attributed to early female figures which do not seem to have been often, or perhaps ever, recounted in earlier Tafsir works, entered the exegetical discourse. The result was a posthumous picture of a greater number of women participating in an exegetical undertaking beyond what had likely ever existed historically. There is a fascinating tension here between the near exclusion of female interpretive authority as a possibility in lived reality and the wish, or perhaps even the need, at times to imagine it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ash. Is it ready? I'm Lisa. Okay, thank you, Ash, very much for this enlightening and illuminating talk. I think there is a great challenge for Muslim feminists and for especially a perspective on early Islam and Quranic hermeneutics. Yeah, that's what I see or understand from your paper. That's what I extract somehow from my own perspective, for the Muslim feminist perspective from your paper. So thank you. We are now going to have a panel discussion, and you are also invited to be part of it. So I will introduce shortly ță enita Karić. She's Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Cultural Heritage at the Department of History, European Studies and Religious Studies at the University of Amsterdam. And she's the author of the wonderful book, Bosnian Hajj Literature, Multiple Paths to the Holy, and a number of articles. Welcome, ță enita.
Thank you so much.
And my former colleague, she was also my former colleague, Iyad Awadi. He's a postdoctoral researcher at Cardiff University as part of the Legacies of Learning project, which focuses on knowledge production and transmission in pre-modern Islamic societies. And I'm going to try to be a humble part also of the discussion. My name is Nimet Şeker. I am Professor of Islamic Textual Studies at the Berlin Institute of Islamic Theology. My research focuses on hermeneutical, methodological, and gender issues in Quranic exegesis. So I think, ță enita, you would like to start.
So thank you, first of all, Professor Geissinger, for a wonderful talk and for a wonderful paper, and thank you, Nimet, also for inviting me to be a part of the discussion. So basically, as I was reading the text, the article, I kept thinking about an image I saw in an archive in Bosnia. So basically, in this small excerpt, which is from a 17th century sermon collection, we see a scribe talking about Rabia al-Adawiya, a famous Sufi, an eponymous figure in Islamic tradition. And as the scribe was describing a small scene, he said, basically he wrote on Rabia al-Adawiya, أنها كانت في الصلاة, and then فسجدت على. But as you can see here, the te is kind of an afterthought. So it's above, meaning that the scribe or whoever was writing this probably forgot in the process of writing that Rabia al-Adawiya was a woman. So I call this te the elevated te of femininity, or in a way to kind of indicate that oftentimes writing about women was not a process which kind of came easy. So basically it kind of leads me to some of the ideas which came up as I also read Professor Geissinger's article, which is basically the tension between the historical writing, the process of historical writing, and agency, female agency. So can we talk about female agency in historical sources? What would agency mean in that sense if we define, for example, agency as the capability to fulfill one's full potential? So can we really find that in the historical sources? Can we maybe differentiate between the presence, involvement, and full-fledged agency? And in that sense, if we're kind of focused on the agency, then obviously it becomes a feminist issue. But if we kind of look into the historical writing, is history really a friend or an ally to the feminist issue in this sense? And then this leads me to two questions, which is something which I'm also struggling in my own research. One would be, what is the relevance of the historical sources in this way for our present moment? Do we need history to kind of confirm what we want to achieve nowadays? And the second question is related more concretely to what you call reservoir of proof texts. And at some point you say that they are sometimes not really historically verified. So do they need to be historically verified? Can we just look into these reservoirs of proof texts as in their own context, meaning to kind of see what they actually meant for the communities in which they originated and afterwards, without necessarily looking into their historical dimension? So thank you.
Would you like to respond or?
Sure.
Yeah, just talk to that mic.
Okay. Thank you for your comments. Wow, okay. There are a lot of directions that anyone could take this. As far as the issue of agency is concerned, that's a whole can of worms in terms of how do we even define it and so on. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with the debates in anthropology about Muslim feminism, or sorry, Muslim women and agency, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's a complicated issue. I mean, there is definitely a gap between history, because it's not being written by the women who it's about, and whatever they did, intended, wanted, or whatever agency they were exercising. And so it is difficult to find some sort of historical basis of that. I mean, in the beginning, when I was researching this, I did take a much more, I guess, optimistic approach to the question of what you can find and not. In the end, I concluded that what is more important, really, is this long tradition of citing these representations in the Tafsir tradition. So what's it doing? It's doing different things at different times, I think. And in terms of what it's doing nowadays in terms of the reservoir of proof text, it does whatever people want it to do. So back to the issue of power, which, yes, I know a lot of people find depressing. Ultimately, I think it depends on the question of who it is who's going to use examples for particular purposes. So, I mean, there are some very conservative readings of these examples, as I'm sure, yeah, we all know. And then there are people who read them in order to try to expand opportunities. So ultimately it comes down to the question of who has the power to define for the community what a particular example means. But the notion that there are some people in a community who need to always be finding a historical precedent for their right to exist and be and exercise, the full potential of humanity, I mean, I would say that's what the problem is.
Could you would you specify the last point a little more?
Because for people who have the most power, so in this case, in terms of our text, what we're talking about are free, adult, sane, non-disabled Muslim men, according to the norms of the text. These are the people who get to just exist in the world and not have to justify their right to move freely, to read and write, to study to the highest levels if that's their aptitude and they have the necessary wherewithal to do that, and to exercise authority, to raise their voice in public, and I could go on and on. Whereas in the case of anyone else who's lower in the idealized hierarchy, there are all these ifs and ands and buts and limitations, and you need to justify, and so on. And so when these texts are, brought over into the modern, our contemporary situation, then, yeah, that often does feed into that whole type of discourse as well. So that women, for example, need to demonstrate that, yes, you have the right to study to the highest levels, you have the right to preach to, the community and not simply to women and children, and you have the right to enter the mosque, and et cetera, et cetera. These long-running and interminable debates. So ultimately it comes down to a question of who can just exist without having to always argue that, they have some sort of warrant from the past or from God to do that, and who has to be always arguing that, yes, we do have this right. So that's a relationship of power. I think that's the root of the issue.
Thank you, Professor. I read and listened to your article with a lot of interest, just following up from what you and ța enita have said. It does look bleak sometimes, but I guess from a historian's perspective, trying to get at the histories of people who are marginalized. As you mentioned, it's very difficult given the nature of the text that we have. But I wonder, just picking up from what you said, if we can sort of add certain things to this to sort of maybe try and maybe problematize some concepts a bit more, and maybe perhaps think a bit more about knowledge production in slightly different ways. So, for example, the question of authorship. There are discussions in anthropology and ethnography now about collective authorship and what that might look like. So when an ethnographer goes into the field and interviews people, who is actually the author of the text that they come up with? In the same way, we have a similar phenomenon in oral histories when they're collated in Islamic history. And often, I guess, so I work mainly on the institutionalization of Sufism in the 12th and 13th centuries. And this was a period in which, it was Seljuks kind of in decline and everything. But you do have the phenomenon of female Turkic rulers throughout the Muslim world, and what that might look like in terms of, these royal women were sort of credited with patronizing a lot of charitable endowments in which Sufis operated in, and so I think perhaps if we can think about the sort of, maybe try and think about the sort of the economics, the creation of a space of knowledge production. In a way that sort of might give us access to different readings of what we're seeing. So one example, for example, from Faridin Attar's hagiography of Rabia, there's one story in which Rabia goes on Hajj, and when she arrives at the Kaaba, she begins to menstruate and she can't complete the Hajj. And this is interpreted for her as the first step along the path of Sufism, towards the path of Sufism. And so that sort of barrier towards completing a ritual observation becomes a sort of integrated, embedded in this like Sufi framework of piety and spiritual progression. Obviously, there are all sorts of interpretations, but part of me also thinks maybe this is an experience that's quite common for Muslim women who go to Hajj, and this is a way of sort of embedding it into a sort of framework that sees it as a sort of spiritual, a path along the spiritual journey towards God. And I wonder whether the patronage of relations and the presence of royal women might have encouraged, or maybe these stories were circulating, got written down, and maybe perhaps they speak to a female audience of some sort. That's just like one thought, basically. And then my last point was, to what extent do you think sort of Quran commentaries are sort of norm defining or norm producing? So in the sense that there are, so in the example that I just gave, for example, there are arenas of norm creation that are based on bodily behaviors, practices, devotions, and that these norms might be just as important for our understanding of normativity in the Islamic past. And that's not to say that it still doesn't marginalize certain people or certain bodies, but perhaps we can nuance it in some way and arrive at certain different, maybe not different, but like conclusions that give us access into spaces that we thought we didn't have access to. Sorry if I went on for too long.
No.
Yeah.
I think we will try to split. I heard like 3 separate, which were all really very interesting areas of questions, and you can respond to whatever seems to resonate with you. Just talk to that microphone.
Oh, okay. That's a lot of very interesting points. I mean, I'm looking at a very particular section of the Tafsir tradition, so Sunni. I have not looked at Sufi Tafsir, which is a whole other area with a different hermeneutic. And I haven't looked at non-Arabic language Tafsir either. So, and even what is known about the type of tafsir that I was talking about, I mean, as I said, there are many debates about the history of tafsir. Many commentaries haven't survived, apparently. At least we're not sure if they have survived or not. They might be in manuscript somewhere waiting for somebody to think that, yes, this should be, edited and printed. So, I mean, our understandings of the history of even this type of tafsir could change significantly in the next 20, 30 years, who knows? Or, well, nowadays everything's faster because, it's printed, it's uploaded on the internet, and then the world can see it. So, I mean, this is inevitably a very partial and tentative reconstruction on the basis of the sources that I used. In terms of, Ottoman Turkish sources, I have never used those, so can't speak to what they might contain or what sort of connections there might be with Turkic royal women and various types of interpretations of the Quran. But it's an interesting question. So, I mean, there's a lot of research to be done here, right? So I'm not trying to suggest that there is this clear notion of what happened and we've settled it. I mean, there is a lot that we haven't looked into. As far as the issue of how norm-producing commentaries are, I think they're probably more norm-producing now than they ever were in the past, simply because they've got so much of an audience. So now it's all online. There are various sites that you probably are more familiar with than I am, where, you know, you can type in a Quranic verse and then, you know, click and you see the commentaries of, you know, 5 or more different classical commentators. To say nothing of commentaries now that have been summarized and translated into multiple languages and are available through apps, Ibn Kathir especially, and so on. So, I mean, these authors were not writing for the general public who are not scholars. They never thought that people who aren't scholars, who don't know Arabic, who aren't Muslim, will look at this stuff and draw their own conclusions. And they
part of the male elite.
Yeah, I mean, they're talking largely, depending on the commentary. I mean, some of them are more geared towards addressing people who aren't part of the scholarly elite than others, but they didn't think that random people are just going to be able to access this stuff and pick it up and read it without some sort of scholarly guidance being given to them. Much less that people are going to access it in English translation. Now, that's something they would have never thought about. So, yeah, now you have much more access, and the notion that anyone can, you know, look up something and know what the Tafsir tradition had to say about a particular verse. So, yeah, I would say that this is actually more of an issue than it was in the past.
But I would like to add, is the mic working? Okay. To add that I think there has been a shift in our time about the idea what tafsir is and what the task of tafsir is. I think that contemporary Muslims, and this starts somewhere in the 19th century maybe, and it's quite explicit in the work of people like Fazlur Rahman, and in women's works, in the work of Wadud and Barlas, it's really explicit that tafsir is the place where non-production is going to take place. So it's not fiqh like in the past. So in the past you had the idea of the disciplines, maybe they were permeable, I don't know if that's the right word, durchlässig in German, but they had their tasks, like fiqh was about non-production or production, usul al-fiqh was about the methodology and so on, and kalam was about normative thinking, about the belief and the aqidah. And tafsir was more descriptive. I think the pre-modern tafsir was not about, in general, about giving the believing Muslim or Muslima an answer about how they should practice their belief. That was the place of fiqh. But in our time, we believe that tafsir is the place where we will find, and we have to find, the answer. That's why we read the tafsir, the pre-modern tafsir, from our perspective. Any comments on that? So if not, I would take up the question, your first question about authorship. So I'm very interested in also your ideas about pre-modern authorship in general, not only the authorship of Tafsir, but also other works. I always have to think about At-Tabari's huge mega volume Tafsir. I cannot believe that one single person, man, woman, whatever, that one person has had the capacity, the brain capacity in the past to transmit so much narration, so many narrations. Only if you take only the narrations into account. I don't know how many are they. I'm sure Turul knows because he's worked on At-Tabari's Tafsir and the narrations in At-Tabari's Tafsir. So, but there are thousands. And I know from European medieval studies, at least from German medieval studies, that they have come to the conclusion that major works from the Middle Ages were not the work of a single author, but they have been produced by a they have been written by a collective of authors. But over time, they have been transmitted under the name of one person, which was a man, a male associated, a masculine associated name, like Hartmann von Auer-Ehrich is just one example from the medieval German literature. But especially for the very known Nibelungensaga, the Nibelungenlied, it's very well studied that this piece of literature was not written by a single person. So is it possible that we, can we learn from this for Islamic studies? Is it thinkable or is it possible? And if yes, what would be the way for the methodology for historians to study this aspect of authorship? And I think if we will be able to find ways to study this, it can be possibly really groundbreaking for the idea of have women and not, I will say non-men being able to participate in knowledge production in general. So what do you think? I hope that I could frame my thought. Yeah.
Jennifer first.
So you started the question.
But I don't have answers. Yeah, I think that's true. I think a lot of, especially in certain genres, there is a collective, the sort of collection of collective works, and also, I mean, authorship is sometimes difficult to determine in Sufi texts. Some texts are ascribed to Al-Ghazali and Ibn Arabi, and still there's debate over who wrote them, and sometimes you just come to the conclusion that it must have been written by some of his students or something. I work mainly on Kubrawi Sufis and the Tafsir, the Tafsir if you want to call it, Ta'wilat Najmiya is definitely a co-authored work with no, attributed to Kubra, Najmuddin Kubra sometimes, who died in 1221. But, you know, and almost, you can't really say it was his work. And I think actually sometimes the attempts of historians to figure out who the real author is a bit of a distraction. Yeah, because distraction, yeah, because it almost, yeah, it doesn't really matter because but yeah, and to go back to your comment about what was the role of tafsir, I mean, from my readings of, at least in the Sufi context, it's very much also a devotional act to write a tafsir, and that's why the Ta'wilat Najmiya was completed by subsequent students or members of the Kubrawi, what came to be known as the Kubrawi Sufi school. I mean, they say that, I mean, the main motivation that's cited is a devotional act. Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at the past, I think sometimes if we think that tafsir is where norms are produced, it's not always, I don't think it's always accurate for the past. I think today it is, maybe, probably, but I think that's also baggage of sort of how we view religion in general today, and what religion should be and what it should look like.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on what you said. I also agree that there is too much focus on the question of authorship and like who the exact author is. Maybe it would be more productive to kind of look beyond what beyond the question of who wrote this or what is this, into the question of what does this do and how does it function in a community or communities it kind of comes to. So again, like Rabia comes to my mind. Like her figure has been, I think it's probably one of the most mythologized figures in Islamic, especially Sufi history, because you find the figure of Rabia al-Adawiya in many different contexts, not only in like explicitly Sufi treatises or similar literature, but also you can find it like in travelogues. Like Evliya Çelebi basically goes from like village to village and compares women to whether they look like Rabia al-Adawiya, whether they are morally like Rabia al-Adawiya or they're not. So it basically becomes more than just an author, more than just like a figure. And especially if we know that Rabia al-Adawiya basically she didn't, I mean, we don't have much evidence that what is ascribed to her is indeed what she spoke or did. So in a way, maybe it's really better to look beyond the facts and like beyond the search for the facts and the search for who authored this, in a way, to the context and the effect it does. And I had other point. Yeah, my other point was maybe as historians we are too much focused on one type of investigation, but there should be maybe more focus done regarding the spaces in which these in which these types of vaguely termed works were transmitted or created. And in that sense, maybe history should kind of just reach out to other disciplines. And we spoke quickly yesterday about archaeology. So maybe just reaching out to other disciplines which can kind of help us in understanding the issue.
Would you like to respond?
Sure. Okay, so as far as the issue of collective authorship is concerned, yeah, I would apply it to the whole, hadith corpus in terms of, regardless of what our ability is or isn't to prove who said what and who transmitted what, that this in the end was what the community decided was, inherited as, that this is what the Prophet or early Muslims had to say about early events and beliefs and experiences and so on. So it's a sort of a collective heritage. And then when you have Tafsir works which are quoting from this, they're also, they're interfacing with that whole collective heritage, and they're taking it on selectively. I mean, inevitably selectively, because there are way too many hadith. Even in the case of Suyuti's Dur al-Manthur, he could not possibly pack them all in, even if I don't think that was what he wanted to do. But even if he had wanted to, it would have been a much too large book for that. So yeah, there's always a process of selectivity that's going on as well, which is, yes, again, back to power. I mean, I don't think that the issue of that the issues of power are necessarily negative. I mean, you have power in every space. The question is really who gets to exercise it and who doesn't, and who tries sometimes, and so on. As far as the issue of tafsir producing norms, again, I mean, historically speaking, I would ask, so how did we end up with this situation? What has produced this expectation today? And there are particular movements and technological changes and individual personalities and so on that we can point to as fostering this. So I mean, I don't think any religious community just sort of assumes that certain aspects of the heritage are important. Like this isn't just a natural process that comes from nowhere. It comes because people are being told that, well, these aspects of the heritage are what matters, and this is what we need to focus on, and this is what you need to learn, and as well as technology making it all uber available. So it's, the growth of neo-traditionalism, so this idea that, romanticizes the medieval past and makes people want to travel to places to get isnads until now and so on. That's a movement that arose in the 80s and 90s in North America and in the UK as a result of a reaction against Salafism. Long story, and Wala Kisse has written a book about this recently, which hopefully some people have read, and if not, it's a very interesting book, where she's looked at a small slice of that. So, these are particular historical processes.
Thanks. If you don't have, or we don't have any more questions or comments, I would like to open the floor for questions and comments. Yes, please. I will come to you.
Thank you very much. I think it's very inspiring about what you're talking actually as somebody who's not doing textual work in the sense. My question is related to the pictures of women at those times, related at those times you were speaking of at the 9th century, the 10th century. I was wondering how much important is it also to look at these pictures of women or how they are received in these cultures at these times, to understand as well the attitude of male to oppress their ideas or not to mention them and so on. Because when I look at today, we have a lot of young Muslim women who are looking for male authorities to listen to them, but they don't tend to listen to Muslim women authorities, interestingly. It's a question of who do we call as Muslim female authority. Today, I'm really wondering if there are some people like this, because we don't, we ourselves, we don't call somebody like this actually, but males do. They say, this is an authority, but nobody says, Professor Nimet Şeker is an authority in Quranic studies. Nobody's doing this. I hope they will. I do it, but yeah, thank you.
You are free to respond, also you, ța enita and Iyad. I'm going to stand and walk a little bit now. I think your question was related to what did you mean by pictures? Like images, visual pictures, or the representation of women in general in texts? Okay.
Well, I guess,
Yeah, just talk to the microphone, please.
I guess it again goes back to the question of power. Who holds the power, whether institutional or whether symbolical power? That's like who we, in a way, decide to be an authority. So basically just maybe fixing where the power goes to, or who has the power, can kind of lead to, correcting what you said about how the society does not perceive female leaders as, authoritative figures. So it's, again, a question of power.
My question was more like, even today, we are asking these gender roles. We say women are not anymore just mothers. They are also scientists, for example. So how was the picture of the culture, the picture of a woman in the culture? Did they say, yes, a woman should just be a mother and should be, doing care work, but she should not be a thinker? So did the commentaries think more about women like a mother Rabiatul Adawiyya as somebody, oh, she is a Sufi, yeah, okay, but she is a lay person? Or what did they say about these women? What was the picture of women at those times? Maybe now it's... I'm sorry for my bad English.
Well, they didn't, I mean, they thought of human beings in general in terms of a whole hierarchical structure. So they weren't, what they would have said about women would depend on what place the woman was in terms of, you know, is she free? Is she enslaved? Is she from an elite family? Is she from a scholarly family? Is she a child? Is she an adult? Is she married? Is she not? I mean, they had different ways of thinking about what roles humans should play depending on their place in the social status. And the difference between being free and being enslaved was absolutely extremely consequential to all of that. So, in other words, their way of thinking about gender is not the way that we do. We have a much more simplified, I guess, view of it, where, you know, the focus is on, well, are you male or are you female? And therefore, rules and roles and so on follow from that. And anyone who doesn't fall into those categories is essentially invisibilized. So the focus on women being mothers, I mean, back in the day, the focus on, in terms of that would be primarily for free women, especially for those who are from more elite parts of society where the focus is, you know, you need to produce the heirs. For enslaved women, well, again, that would depend on what it was that their particular function in the household would be for. But no, the idea that women in general that their role is all to be a mother, that was not the terms in which they thought at the time. The idea nowadays that one finds in conservative spaces and not just Muslim spaces, I mean, in North America now, I'm sure everyone sees this on the news, there is a resurgence of of conservative ideas about the roles of women and so on, and the idea that, you know, the most important thing is that you're bearing children for the nation, and you know, that you should be at home when your children are small at least, and et cetera, et cetera. That's a very 19th, 20th century approach to gender.
Yeah, just to add or follow up on the question of motherhood. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's articulated as women are meant to be mothers or something like that. But definitely in Sufi piety, there's an emphasis on women as carers or nurturers, and that's how their piety is performed a lot of the time. So you have this, and there's a good book on this in the European in the medieval European context, called by Caroline Walker Bynum. I think it's called Holy Fasting, Holy Feasting, but I'm not sure of the title now. I think it's Fasting and Feasting, but it's about how women could also use these tropes to subvert expectations. So by practicing extreme asceticism and becoming very self-denying in terms of food, and she sort of links this to, you know, extreme acts of piety and devotion that were socially subvertive, but through the act of, for example, emaciation and you can see similar developments in the Islamic context as well. So you can see this in the case of the stories that begin to emerge about Rabia in the 12th, 13th century, about her being extremely self-denying, feeding others, but rarely eating herself and practicing vegetarianism when, that was a trope common to all Sufis in the early period, but in the later period, it wasn't expected that you would practice vegetarianism, but still Radha is associated with vegetarianism even in those periods. The way in which motherhood could function as a discourse, when you have this sort of institutionalization of Sufi communities, you do get a lot of discussions of the sheikh as a mother, Sufi sheikh as a mother, so breastfeeding disciples with spiritual milk, and then you even get this idea of the main sheikh being your birth mother sheikh, and other sheikhs being wet nurses. So the surname Daya, a lot of Sufis have this name Daya, which means wet nurse in Persian. But that functions to like mark out a hierarchical difference between masters and disciples. So it's still sort of used as a sort of power sort of relation. Again, it's just an interesting usage of terms of motherhood and breastfeeding and things like that, which were not always related to sort of domestic relations, perhaps, but also could be a bit broader. And obviously, in fiqh, there's the idea of breastfeeding as creating kinship forms outside of the family as well. So it's not the nuclear family that we think of when we think of motherhood in the medieval past.
Yeah, if I could just add, basically we also have to be very careful which type of period we're talking about and also what type of geography we are focusing on. Yossi Rapoport, for example, has a really interesting book on basically women, money, and divorces in medieval Cairo, where basically the rate of divorces in medieval Cairo was much higher than today. So it's kind of like the situation in that part, but then when we move to the Ottoman period and the situation completely changes. So I guess there is a tendency to look into the pre-modern past as like this one huge unified period, which is not true. So there is also like regional and temporal variations as well.
Yes. Are there questions? Yeah.
This is I guess, a fairly specific question for Professor Geissinger, which is hopefully not too narrowly technical. But I noticed that you actually, I think, twice invoked cases where some of your female exegetes were engaged in basically widening the understanding of what it means to be a mujahid fi sabilillah, which is very interesting. And I guess what I'm wondering, prompted by that, is do you think there's a tendency for female exegetes to be invoked in contexts where certain kinds of derogations or relaxations of almost an overly restricted model of excellence is sort of the end in view? So like just to reiterate your category, you invoked sort of the free male Muslim able-bodied person. And you could add to that the free male Muslim able-bodied person in fighting shape if you take a sort of restrictive understanding of what it means to be, a mujahid fi sabilillah. So the fact that you have female commentators being invoked as sort of a, to widen the category of what it means to be engaged in struggle in God's path is kind of interesting. And the reason it occurred to me is you have a parallel case with martyrdom, and that initially, the shaheed is technically supposed to be the person, man qutila fi sabilillah on the battlefield, but eventually As-Suyuti, for instance, has a book where he outlines 7 kinds of martyrdom, one of which is actually women who die in childbirth. So yeah, I mean, is there a sense in which there's something pointed and sort of strategic about where female commentators may be invoked that speaks to like the entanglement of gender categories with other concerns about sort of overly restrictive models and ideals of what kind of identity markers virtue can be attached to.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. In the case of these two examples, probably not. But overall, that's something that, yeah, I would like to look into further. In the case of these two examples, so Fatima of Nishapur's advice, as she's interpreting those verses about fighting and saying, no, this is about your desires, was to her male student. So he said to her, as the story goes, advise me. And so, she gives him this advice. And it's in line with broader Sufi ideas about, that the greater jihad is to struggle against your own desires and so on. And there's a famous hadith that expresses that idea also. So in that particular case, I think it's more an idea that, she's reflecting a reading that later on becomes something that's more generally identified with renunciants as well as with later on when you have them Sufis. In the case of Makil, I think the issue with that particular hadith is more a question of emphasizing the merits of performing the Umrah. So the pilgrimage that's not the Hajj, which can be done at any time of the year and especially meritorious in Ramadan. And to tie the idea of a meritorious lesser pilgrimage during Ramadan to the Quran in that particular way. So it's a pietistic impulse. So you do see a lot, and I noticed this type of affinity a lot, though, that you see a lot of hadith which are being used exegetically, which are attributed to women, being used to cement or further advance pietistic sorts of interpretations of the Quran. So there's a nexus between, women as sources of exegetical materials and various pious practices, which are outside of, the 5 daily prayers and so on. But in terms of your larger point, yes, thank you. That's an interesting idea.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Ash, for your contribution, and thank you for coming all the way from Canada to Berlin. It's been a pleasure and an honor to hear you and to meet you in person. And thank you to Iyad, thank you to ța enita, and thank you to the audience. I think we will have a lunch break in about half an hour, and see you at next panel.